It came without warning. No muzzle flash, no smoke trail, no sound until it was already too late. Veterans who survived described the same cold instinct, the sudden, desperate knowledge that something was watching them, calculating the distance, waiting for the stillness between heartbeats. And then a single crack, sharp as a whip, and another soldier would drop into the mud, and the men around him would scramble behind trees or walls or rubble, pressing their bodies flat into the earth, not daring to breathe, not daring to move, because to move was to die. This was what it felt like to be caught in the open by a German sniper during the Second World War. But this documentary is not only about snipers, though they will appear in it. It is about something larger, something that changed the nature of combat itself, something that forced generals to rewrite tactics, soldiers to change how they moved, how they thought, how they survived. It is about the weapon, or more precisely, the combination of weapons and tactics that the German military refined to a terrifying degree, that turned ordinary soldiers into instruments of maximum lethality, and that left Allied forces scrambling to adapt across every major theater of the war. It is about the doctrine the Germans called Vernichtungsgedanke, the idea of annihilation, and the tools they built to deliver it. To understand why German weapons and tactics terrified their enemies so deeply, you have to understand the world they were born from. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation rebuilding its military from near nothing. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the Reichswehr of its heavy weapons, restricted its troop numbers, and left it a hollow shell. But the German military command had spent the interwar years doing something unusual. Rather than simply mourning the losses of the First World War, they studied them with obsessive precision. They read the after-action reports. They interviewed survivors. They examined what had worked in 1918, the stormtrooper tactics, the elastic defense, the deep infiltration raids, and they asked themselves a question that few armies were seriously asking at the time. What if we built an entirely new kind of army? The result was blitzkrieg, though the Germans themselves rarely used that word. They called it Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, and at its heart was not just speed but integration. The idea that armor, infantry, artillery, and air power should not operate as separate arms occasionally cooperating with each other, but as a single fist, each element amplifying the others, striking faster than an enemy could respond, bypassing strength and finding weakness, collapsing command structures before defenders could organize. And to make that fist as lethal as possible, Germany built weapons that were, in several key areas, genuinely ahead of their time. Imagine a French soldier in May 1940. He has been stationed along the Ardennes sector, the dense forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. His commanders have told him this sector is safe. The terrain is too rough, too forested for a serious armored thrust. The real attack will come further north, as it did in 1914. So his unit waits and patrols and listens to distant artillery. Then one morning the forest moves. It seems almost impossible at first. Through the trees, through the morning mist rising off the Meuse River, comes the sound of engines, dozens of engines, hundreds of engines, and then the shapes of tanks emerge, more tanks than he has seen in one place in his entire life. And they are not slowing. They are not stopping to bring up artillery or wait for reconnaissance reports. They are rolling through in tight columns, their infantry clinging to the sides of the vehicles, and above them, somewhere in the cloudy sky, he can hear the rising whine of Junkers dive bombers descending toward the crossing points. Within hours, the French defensive line at Sedan ceases to exist. This was the opening of Fall-Gelb Case Yellow, the German invasion of France and the Low Countries, launched on May 10, 1940. In 6 weeks, France, a nation that had fought Germany to a bloody standstill for 4 years in the previous war, collapsed entirely. More than 300,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all of their heavy equipment. It was one of the most stunning military collapses in modern history. And it happened in large part because of the weapons and tactics the Germans had developed and refined over the preceding years. Chief among them was the Panzerkampfwagen, the armored fighting vehicle, the tank. Not a single tank, but a system of tanks designed to operate together. In 1940, the most common German tanks were not technically superior to their French counterparts. The Char B-1 heavy tank and the Matilda II, used by British forces, were in many respects better armored than the Panzer III and Panzer IV that formed the German armored spearhead. The Matilda II, for example, was so well armored that early German anti-tank guns had almost no effect on it at all. There are accounts of German anti-tank crews watching their shells bounce off the Matilda's hull, and for the first time in this war, feeling genuine fear. But German tanks had something that French and British tanks largely lacked: radio. Nearly every German tank had a reliable radio system, allowing commanders at all levels to communicate in real time, to redirect, to exploit gaps, to respond to unexpected enemy movements without waiting for orders to filter down through layers of staff. French tank commanders, by contrast, often had to stop their vehicles, climb out, and walk to the commander of the next tank to pass information. In a battle defined by speed and decision cycles, this difference was almost impossible to overcome. It was the first lesson of what made German weapons so terrifying. The weapon itself was only part of the equation. The system around it, the way it was used, the doctrine that governed it, could transform an ordinary weapon into something that seemed almost supernatural. Nowhere was this more true than with a weapon that became, perhaps more than any other single piece of equipment, the defining symbol of German lethality in the Second World War. The MG-42. Even the name carries a kind of weight. Soldiers who encountered it developed a visceral, almost physical reaction to the sound it made, a sound unlike any other machine gun then in existence. Where the Allied Bren gun fired at roughly 500 rounds per minute with a steady, almost mechanical rhythm, and the American M1919 Browning fired at similar rates with a staccato chatter, the MG-42 fired at an almost incomprehensible rate, 1,200 rounds per minute. Some variants closer to 1,500. At that rate, it was impossible to hear individual shots. What soldiers described instead was a single continuous tearing sound, a ripping, a buzzing. The Americans called it Hitler's buzzsaw. The British and Canadians had names for it that are not suitable for print. Every soldier who heard it for the first time understood instinctively that something unprecedented had entered their war. Picture an American infantry squad advancing through a hedgerow in Normandy, France. It is July 1944. They have been in country for several weeks. D-Day is behind them, but the fighting has not gotten easier. If anything, it has gotten harder. The Norman bocage, the ancient dense hedgerows of the French countryside, has turned the war into a series of small, brutal engagements at close range, where every field is a potential killing ground and every hedgerow a potential ambush. The squad moves carefully in a loose line, rifles at the ready, the point man stepping slowly through the long grass. There is a smell of cattle and cut hay, deceptively peaceful. A meadow opens before them, maybe 150 yards across, and there are two farmhouses on the far side. The sergeant hesitates. He does not like the look of the open ground. He has learned to distrust open ground. He gives the signal. Two men move along the left side of the field, using the hedgerow for cover. Then it happens. The right corner of the far hedgerow erupts in a sound that isn't like any sound they have heard before. A tearing, buzzing rip of noise that seems to last forever and no time at all simultaneously. 3 men are hit before anyone can process what is happening. The survivors are flattened into the earth, hands pressing into the soil as if trying to dig with their bare fingers. And from the far hedgerow, the MG-42 continues to fire, its barrel rotating, sweeping the field in methodical arcs, and the Americans press themselves into the dirt and don't move and don't breathe and wait for death to pass over them. The MG-42 was not simply a machine gun. It was the centerpiece of a tactical philosophy. German infantry doctrine was built around the light machine gun in a way that no other major army had fully committed to. Where American and British doctrine placed the rifle squad at the center, with the machine gun as a support element, German doctrine inverted this. The MG-42 was the squad. Everything else, the riflemen, the grenadiers, existed to protect and enable the machine gun, to carry its ammunition, to suppress enemies who were trying to destroy it, to cover its movements when it needed to change position. This meant that a German squad of perhaps 8 to 10 men could deliver a volume of fire that an Allied squad could not match short of calling in heavy support. A well-positioned MG-42 team in a defensive position could cover an enormous field of fire, and its incredible rate of fire meant that any enemy attempting to cross open ground in front of it was gambling with their life. The weapon also had an ingenious barrel change system. At such an extreme rate of fire, gun barrels overheated quickly. The MG-42 was designed so that the barrel could be swapped in just seconds. A trained crew could do it in under 10, using a special tool and insulated gloves, keeping the gun operational almost continuously. Accounts exist of Allied soldiers trying to rush a German MG position during what they thought was a barrel change, only to discover that the gun was firing again before they were halfway across the open ground. There was, however, a weakness, and the Allies eventually learned to exploit it. The MG-42's extraordinary rate of fire consumed ammunition at a staggering pace. The gun needed a constant supply of belted ammunition, and the men carrying that ammunition were just as exposed as the gunners. Allied snipers learned to target the ammunition carriers, because a machine gun without ammunition was simply a heavy metal object that no longer threatened anyone. And Allied artillery controllers learned to call fire accurately enough on identified MG positions that even the best dug emplacement offered limited protection. But learning these lessons took time. It took casualties. It took months of the kind of hard, grinding combat that leaves men changed forever. The MG-42 was terrifying in the open field. But in the cities, in the rubble of the places the war destroyed, a different kind of weapon dominated the landscape. The German sniper. Sniping was not a German invention. The British had produced legendary marksmen in the First World War, and the Russians would go on to produce some of the most lethal snipers in history. But the German military invested heavily in sniper training and equipment from early in the war, and by the middle years of the conflict, a trained German sniper was among the most feared individual combatants any Allied soldier could encounter. The standard German sniper of the Middle War years typically operated with a Karabiner 98K, the bolt-action rifle that had been the German infantryman's primary weapon since before the war, fitted with a telescopic sight, often the 4-power Zielfernrohr scope. It was a precise, reliable weapon, capable of lethal accuracy at ranges beyond 500 meters in skilled hands. Some accounts describe confirmed kills at ranges approaching 1,000 meters, though such extreme distance shooting was rare. What made German snipers genuinely terrifying was not only their accuracy, but their patience. Their training emphasized concealment, camouflage, and a kind of hunter's stillness that most men found almost impossible to maintain for extended periods. A German sniper might spend 8, 10, 12 hours in a single concealed position, barely moving, controlling even his breathing, waiting for the one shot that would justify the entire day. Imagine the city of Ortona, Italy, December 1943. Canadian troops of the 1st Infantry Division have been fighting through this small Adriatic port city for days. The Germans have fortified it, block by block. They have knocked holes in the walls between houses so their soldiers can move through interior corridors without exposing themselves to the streets. They have placed machine guns in every window that offers a field of fire. And in the ruins of the upper stories, in the broken masonry and twisted steel, they have placed snipers. A Canadian soldier named Private William McCulloch. His name is invented, but his story is not moves along a rubble-strewn alley beside the church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli. His section has been in contact for 3 hours. 2 men are already down. He is moving quickly, using corners and rubble as cover, covering 20 or 30 feet at a run before pressing himself against another wall. He stops, listens. There is a sound somewhere above him. Not a shot. Not yet. Something like gravel shifting. He presses himself tighter against the wall. He looks up slowly, tilting only his head, and sees nothing but broken stone and the gray December sky. He waits. He waits far longer than feels reasonable. Then he moves, and nothing happens. 40 feet further down the alley, the man behind him is not so lucky. There is a single crack, flat and hard, and the man drops. The section scatters into doorways and crouches behind rubble, and nobody moves until they have watched the windows and rooftops for 10 minutes that feel like 10 years. The shooter is never found. The battle for Ortona lasted 8 days and cost the Canadians over 300 killed. It became known, in a grim tribute to the ferocity of the fighting, as the Little Stalingrad. The German defenders there demonstrated a textbook example of what came to be called Kampfgruppe tactics, improvised battle groups made up of mixed elements, using every available weapon and terrain feature to maximum advantage. And in those improvised defensive positions, German snipers played a central role. It would be too simple to say that German weapons were simply better than Allied weapons. In many categories, they were not. The American M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle gave individual American soldiers a significant advantage in rate of fire over the bolt-action Karabiner 98K. The American and British logistics systems, fed by the industrial capacity of the United States, were ultimately superior to anything Germany could sustain. And in terms of raw armor quality, the Soviet medium tank, when it appeared in numbers in 1942, presented challenges that German tankers found deeply unsettling. But in specific areas, in anti-tank gunnery, in artillery design, in the integration of combined arms tactics, Germany produced weapons and doctrines that genuinely shaped how the entire war was fought. And in no area was this more consequential than in the development of anti-tank weapons that could stop enemy armor cold. In the summer of 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest land invasion in human history, and for the first weeks, it seemed to justify all the confidence with which it had been planned. Soviet forces were overwhelmed, encircled, destroyed in massive pockets. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. The Red Army seemed to be disintegrating. Then the Germans encountered something they had not expected. The T-34 tank appeared on the Eastern Front in the summer and autumn of 1941. And its appearance caused a crisis within the German Armored Command. Here was a tank with sloped armor, a design principle that significantly increased effective protection, with wide tracks that could cross soft ground where German tanks bogged down, with a powerful diesel engine that reduced fire risk, and with a 76mm gun that could penetrate the frontal armor of most German tanks at combat range. German anti-tank crews discovered that their standard anti-tank gun, the 37 PaK 36, was essentially useless against the T-34's sloped armor except at very short range and from specific angles. The men who served those guns gave the weapon a nickname, the door knocker, because firing it against felt about as effective. It made a noise. It announced your presence, and it accomplished nothing. This encounter with an enemy weapon that your own weapons could not reliably defeat is perhaps the most psychologically disorienting experience a soldier can have. And it was about to force the German military to produce, In an extraordinary burst of engineering and manufacturing urgency, a new generation of weapons. The answer came in several forms. The 88mm gun, officially the Flak 18, Flak 36, and later versions, had originally been designed as a high-altitude anti-aircraft weapon. But German commanders in the field, most famously during the Spanish Civil War and in the early campaigns of the Second World War, had discovered that its flat trajectory and devastating muzzle velocity made it equally lethal against armored vehicles. The 88 could destroy virtually any Allied or Soviet tank at combat range, and its accuracy and rate of fire were outstanding. An 88 crew preparing a position operated with disciplined precision. The gun itself was long and imposing. The barrel alone stretched well over 4 meters, and it required a crew of several men to operate effectively. But the results it produced were extraordinary. In North Africa, Rommel used 88s as a central element of his anti-tank defensive lines, luring British armor into mass charges and then opening fire with devastating effect. Tank crews who survived these engagements described the experience in terms that verge on the surreal, watching their companions' vehicles erupt in fire at ranges where they had thought themselves safe, understanding too late the reach and power of a weapon they had not fully respected. And as the war continued, Germany produced dedicated anti-tank versions of the 88, mounted in the devastating tank destroyer Jagdpanther and the Tiger II tank, creating vehicles that could engage and destroy enemy armor at extraordinary range. But the 88, formidable as it was, could not be everywhere. And as the war progressed into its middle years, Germany needed weapons that individual infantrymen could carry and use against the enemy tanks that were appearing in ever greater numbers. What emerged were handheld anti-tank weapons that changed the nature of infantry warfare and left tank crews throughout the Allied armies with a particular and specific dread. The Panzerfaust, literally armor fist, was a remarkable weapon in its simplicity. A disposable tube, a shaped charge warhead, a crude sight. Its range was limited. It required the user to get dangerously close to an enemy tank, often within 50 or 60 meters. But in its hands, a single infantryman could destroy a 30 or 40-ton tank. The psychological implications of this were enormous. Before weapons like the Panzerfaust became common, tanks had operated in built-up areas with a degree of confidence. Enemy infantry might slow them, might threaten them, but a single infantryman with a rifle was not an existential threat to a steel machine. After Panzerfaust, after the German Panzerschreck, a shouldered rocket launcher similar to the American bazooka, every tank crew knew that every alley, every window, every rooftop harbored a potential killer. The tank, which had seemed almost invincible to common soldiers in the early years of the war, became a thing that could die. Soviet tank crews fighting through the streets of German cities in 1945 described the particular horror of this, moving through rubble-choked streets knowing that somewhere in the ruins, a boy with a cardboard tube could end them. Some veterans described a sensation almost like claustrophobia, an awareness that the steel that protected them also trapped them, that the streets were too narrow to maneuver, that they could not see the threat coming. There is a story, historically grounded but with the specific names compressed into type, of a Soviet crew moving through a suburb of Berlin in April 1945. The crew has been fighting for weeks. They are veterans, the survivors of years of war, and they have learned to read the battlefield the way a sailor reads the sea. They enter a street of damaged apartment buildings. The driver slows. The commander scans the windows through his periscope. Nothing. A dead dog in the street. Overturned furniture spilling from a doorway. The kind of stillness that experienced soldiers distrust. The commander calls a halt. He is not sure why. Something is wrong with the quality of the silence. They wait, engine idling, for 30 seconds that feel very long. Then from an upper window, 60 meters ahead, there is a brief gray flash and a line of smoke, and the Panzerfaust round strikes the T-34 on its right side. The tank does not explode immediately. It slews sideways, one track damaged. The crew bails out fast through hatches that are already hot to the touch. Two of them make it to cover behind another wrecked vehicle. Two of them do not. This was April 1945. Berlin was already surrounded. Germany had been losing the war for years, and still the weapons that Germany had built, wielded by soldiers who had been fighting since 1939, remained capable of killing. The German sniper, the MG-42, the 88 gun, the Panzerfaust, these were individual weapons. But perhaps the most terrifying German weapon of the Second World War was not a weapon at all in the conventional sense. It was a method, a way of fighting, a doctrine that integrated all of these weapons into something that was, at its worst, nearly impossible to stop. The Germans called it Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, and it was, in the judgment of many military historians, one of the most sophisticated command philosophies ever developed. Auftragstaktik meant that a commander at any level, a battalion commander, a company commander, a sergeant leading a section, was given an objective and then trusted to achieve it using his own judgment. He was not given a detailed script. He was not required to check back with headquarters for permission to adapt. He was expected to understand the intention behind his orders, not just the orders themselves, and to act accordingly when circumstances changed. Because in war, circumstances always change. This had enormous practical implications. German units could react to unexpected developments far faster than their opponents could. A German sergeant encountering an unexpected gap in the enemy line did not need to send a runner back to the lieutenant who would consult with the captain who would radio the battalion commander. The sergeant could act, and the best German sergeants acted brilliantly. Allied commanders, particularly in the early years, were often trained in much more rigid hierarchical systems that required approval before action. The result, again and again, was that German units could exploit fleeting opportunities that Allied units missed, a gap that existed for 20 minutes before closing, a flank that was momentarily unguarded, a moment of confusion in the enemy command structure. The price of this flexibility was high. Auftragstaktik required soldiers and non-commissioned officers who were capable of independent thought under extreme pressure, men who could understand a tactical situation, make a decision, and execute it while other men were dying around them. Producing such soldiers required an investment in training and leadership development that not every army was willing or able to make. But Germany made it. The Wehrmacht of 1940 and 1941 was, by the judgment of many serious military analysts, the finest tactical land army the world had ever seen. Not the best equipped, not the most numerous, not the army with the best long-term strategic position, but in terms of tactical skill, the ability to fight at the small unit level with speed, aggression, and improvisation, it was extraordinary. This was why France fell in 6 weeks. This was why the early campaigns in North Africa went as well as they did for Rommel against numerically superior opposition. This was why German units in Russia, consistently outnumbered after 1942, continued to inflict casualties at ratios that should not have been possible. It was also why the war took as long as it did. There was another weapon that deserves its own accounting. Not a German design, not in origin, but a weapon that, in German hands, achieved a kind of terrible perfection that its designers had never imagined. The Tiger tank. Officially the Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger Aus. The Tiger entered service in 1942 and immediately began generating a psychological impact out of proportion to its actual numbers. The Germans never produced large quantities of Tigers. Total production reached only about 1,300 vehicles over the course of the war. But the Tiger's combination of thick armor and devastating main gun created something historians have called Tiger fear, a genuine, documented tendency among Allied commanders to attribute every German tank encountered to the Tiger, regardless of what the tank actually was. British after-action reports from North Africa and Italy are filled with accounts of Tiger sightings that were almost certainly encounters with the much more common Panzer IV or Panzer III. Commanders called for artillery support, for anti-tank guns, for aerial strikes, in response to tanks that their standard weapons could have handled. The Tiger had achieved something remarkable. It had become more powerful in the minds of its opponents than it was in the field. But there were real Tigers and real Tiger encounters, and these were genuinely terrifying. Consider what it meant to be a British or American tank crew encountering a Tiger for the first time. Your Sherman tank, reliable and well-maintained, carries an armor-piercing round that can reliably penetrate the frontal armor of most German tanks at combat range. You have trained for this. You are confident in your weapon. Then someone in your formation calls out a Tiger sighting. Your commander looks through his optics at the hulking gray shape of the vehicle beyond, wider and longer than anything you have fought before, with a barrel that looks almost absurdly long for the size of the vehicle it's mounted on. You know from briefings that the Tiger's front armor is 100 millimeters thick. You know that your standard shell will not penetrate it at this range. The Tiger fires first. It fires first at almost every range in which you could hope to harm it, because its 88mm gun can penetrate your armor at a range at which your gun cannot hurt it. A Sherman hit by an 88mm round at combat range did not usually survive. The penetrating round created a pressure wave and a spray of steel fragments inside the crew compartment that were, in most cases, fatal to anyone inside. American and British tank crews developed specific tactics for dealing with Tigers, flanking attacks at close range, where even the Tiger's side and rear armor could be defeated, combined arms assaults with infantry and artillery, aerial attack, but each of these required getting close to something that was trying to kill you from a distance at which you could not effectively fight back. Some crews refused to report Tiger sightings in their after-action reports because they knew that doing so invited skepticism. Sergeant after sergeant wrote variations of the same thing. We know what we saw. It would be misleading, however, to tell the story of German weapons without describing the cost they exacted on Germany itself. The Tiger tank was a marvel of engineering and a logistical nightmare. It was extraordinarily complex to manufacture, requiring skilled labor and specialized components at a time when German industry was under mounting pressure from Allied bombing. It was heavy, over 50 tons, which meant it could cross fewer bridges than lighter tanks, strained its own running gear, and consumed fuel at a rate that stretched German supply lines in campaigns already troubled by supply problems. For every month Germany spent producing a single Tiger, its enemies were producing many times that number of Shermans, T-34s, and other vehicles. The Allies did not need to defeat the Tiger in every individual engagement. They needed only to keep fighting until Germany ran out of Tigers, and eventually it did. This was the deepest paradox at the heart of German weapons development in the Second World War. Germany produced weapons that were, in specific categories, extraordinary. Weapons that inspired genuine dread, that changed tactics, that killed in quantities that seem almost unreal. And in doing so, Germany concentrated its engineering genius and industrial capacity on solutions that could not win the war. 1,000 Tigers could not offset the thousands and thousands of T-34s and Shermans and Churchills rolling off Allied assembly lines. The MG-42 was the finest machine gun of the war, and Germany could not produce ammunition fast enough to supply all the fronts on which it was needed. The 88mm gun was devastating, and Allied air power eventually made it impossible to deploy in daylight without risk of destruction from above. The story of German weapons in the Second World War is inseparable from the story of Allied adaptation. The British, Americans, Canadians, and Soviets were not passive recipients of German firepower. They learned. They adapted. They developed tactics, weapons, and doctrines specifically designed to neutralize German advantages. The Soviet military, beginning in 1942 and accelerating through 1943, underwent a transformation that military historians have called one of the most remarkable institutional adaptations in the history of warfare. Having suffered catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, losses so enormous they seem almost impossible to comprehend, the Red Army rebuilt itself into a force capable not only of matching German tactical skill, but, in certain respects, surpassing it. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the turning point. The Germans launched Operation Citadel, a massive armored offensive intended to cut off a Soviet salient and regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. They committed the best of their armor, Tigers, Panthers, the massive Elephant tank destroyers. They expected to shatter the Soviet defensive lines as they had shattered so many before. What they found instead was a defensive system of extraordinary depth and sophistication, prepared specifically to defeat their armored attack. Soviet engineers had laid an estimated 500,000 mines. Anti-tank guns were positioned in overlapping fields of fire. Artillery had been pre-registered on the approaches the Germans were expected to use. The Soviets had, through intelligence and analysis, essentially read the German plan and prepared the optimal counter. Imagine a Tiger commander at Kursk. Let's call him by his role, not his name, a veteran of 3 years of Eastern Front combat, a man who has learned to read Russian terrain the way the Russians themselves do, who has survived ambushes and artillery barrages and the particular Russian winter that has broken many men around him. He leads his vehicle into the attack on the morning of July 5th. The sky is pale gray with clouds, and the steppe stretches ahead in the early summer green, and for the first few kilometers the attack goes as expected. The German artillery has done its work. There are craters and burning vehicles and the debris of a defensive line that has been hit hard. Then his driver suddenly calls out and the Tiger lurches. A mine. The left track is shredded. The vehicle stops dead in the middle of what the crew now realizes is a minefield. Through the periscope, the commander can see other vehicles also stopped, also struck, and from somewhere in the distance, Soviet artillery is already adjusting its fall of shot. He issues orders quickly. The crew bails out. They move carefully between the craters, one step at a time, testing the ground, knowing that any step could be the last. Around them, the greatest armored battle in history is developing across dozens of kilometers of Russian steppe, and these 5 men are walking very slowly through a minefield, listening to the sound of guns and hopping to live until evening. The Soviets won at Kursk. The German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front never recovered. From July 1943 onward, the story of the Eastern Front was one of progressive German retreat, of defensive battles that delayed but could not stop the Red Army's inexorable advance westward. But the fighting remained brutal, and German weapons remained lethal until the final days of the war. Allied forces advancing into Germany in the winter of 1944 to 1945 found themselves confronting an enemy that was depleted in numbers, exhausted in spirit, often fighting on rations that would have been considered inadequate at any other point in the war, and yet still capable of delivering sudden, violent, and effective resistance. This was the dark final chapter of German military capability. Units that had been shattered and rebuilt 3 times, equipped with whatever weapons remained available, fighting not for victory but for time or for pride, or for the simple momentum of men who had been soldiers for years and knew nothing else. And among these last defenders, the weapons that had defined the German military since 1939 were still present: the machine guns, the anti-tank weapons, the snipers, wielded by men who had long since ceased to believe in the cause but had not yet ceased to fight. There is one more weapon, or rather one more system, that demands inclusion in this story. Because of all the German weapons and tactics of the Second World War, none created a more lasting psychological legacy, None haunted the men who faced it quite so persistently. None embedded itself so deeply in the nightmares of survivors. That weapon was the Nebelwerfer. Known to Allied soldiers as the Screaming Mimi or the Moaning Mini, the Nebelwerfer was a multi-barrel rocket launcher that combined two distinct terror elements in a single weapon system. The first was its warhead, a heavy explosive charge capable of devastating effect against men in the open and penetrating even reasonably well-constructed field positions. The second was the sound. When a Nebelwerfer battery fired, the rockets it launched did not travel in silence. Their design, with the propellant burning from the tail, created a distinctive oscillating shriek as they arced through the sky, a sound that veterans described as somewhere between a scream and a moan. A rising and falling wail that announced death was coming and told you nothing about where it was going to land. Experienced soldiers could often judge incoming artillery by its sound and take cover accordingly. A trained ear could distinguish between different calibers, could estimate distance, could make reasonable predictions about the trajectory and likely impact area. None of these skills applied to the Nebelwerfer. Its rockets seemed almost random in their final approach. You heard the sound, and you threw yourself flat and you hoped. An American infantryman named, let us say he represents all of them, Private First Class Joseph Kowalski, moving with his platoon through the Huichin Forest in November 1944. The Huichin Forest was one of the most savage battlegrounds American forces encountered in the European theater. Dense fir trees, deep ravines, early winter mud that sucked boots off feet, and German defensive positions that had been prepared for months, designed to make the forest itself a weapon. The platoon is moving through trees so close together that visibility is perhaps 20 meters. There is no sky visible, only the dark canopy above and the gray light coming through. A shell bursts in the trees somewhere to the left, and the airburst sends fragments down through the canopy. Another German advantage of this terrain. The way artillery rounds caught in the treetops sent their blast and fragments downward rather than outward, defeating the instinct to go flat. Then the sound begins. It starts low, barely distinguishable from the wind. It rises. It shifts in pitch, oscillating, climbing, and every man in the platoon knows what it is, and there is a moment, perhaps a second, perhaps two, where everyone simply stands still, because there is nowhere to run that is clearly better than where you are. And in that second the sound is everything, filling the mind, displacing thought. And then the rockets land in a line through the trees, and the forest disintegrates into light and noise and dirt, and the men who are still alive are on the ground without knowing how they got there. The Huichin Forest campaign cost American forces more than 30,000 casualties. It achieved almost none of its strategic objectives, and it demonstrated, as clearly as any single campaign in the war, that German defensive tactics, even deployed by a depleted and retreating army, remained capable of extracting a terrible price from any attacker. The German weapons that made this possible were not all advanced. Some were as simple as the mines buried in the forest paths. Some were as conventional as the machine guns placed to cover the trails. But their deployment, informed by Auftragstaktik, by years of hard-won experience, by the particular German skill for terrain appreciation and defensive improvisation, made them exponentially more lethal than their technical specifications alone would suggest. This is the lesson that the Second World War taught about weapons, and it is a lesson that military historians and strategists have carried forward in the decades since. A weapon is not its specifications. A weapon is its specifications, plus its doctrine, plus the training of the men who use it, plus the command philosophy that governs how it is deployed, plus the experience accumulated through years of combat, plus something harder to quantify. A certain mental orientation toward the battlefield, a willingness to act before the situation is fully clear, a tolerance for uncertainty that turns average soldiers into genuinely dangerous ones. Germany, at the height of its military power, combined all of these elements. It produced weapons that were in some cases technically superior and in others only adequate, and it surrounded those weapons with a system of thought and practice that made them terrifying. And yet the story ends as it must. The factories of Detroit and Sverdlovsk and Birmingham kept working. The convoys kept crossing the Atlantic. The supply of men, material, and will that the Allies brought to bear on Germany was something no tactical genius could overcome, no weapon system could neutralize. By 1945, Germany was a nation fighting on three sides, its cities bombed into rubble, its fuel supplies critically depleted, its best soldiers dead or in captivity, its replacements increasingly young or old or simply unprepared for what they were being asked to do. The weapons that had terrorized a continent were still there. The MG-42 was still firing in the rubble of Cologne and Frankfurt and Berlin. German snipers were still operating in the ruins of cities that barely existed anymore. Panzerfausts were being handed to teenagers drafted into Volkssturm units that had never had proper training. The weapons outlasted the system that had given them meaning. What ended German resistance was not, ultimately, a better weapon. It was industrial scale, strategic vision, coalition warfare, and an Allied decision to fight through to unconditional surrender rather than negotiating an armistice that might leave the underlying problem unresolved. It was also the Soviet Union absorbing, over 4 years, casualties that would have broken most nations, and continuing to fight, and continuing to advance, until the Red Army was in Berlin. The soldiers who fought against German weapons in the Second World War, the Americans in the hedgerows, the British in the desert, the Canadians on the Italian coasts, the Soviets on the endless steppe, they are mostly gone now. The last of them are very old, and each year there are fewer. But the weapons they faced and the tactics those weapons embodied have not been forgotten. Military academies still study German combined arms doctrine. The MG-42's design was so effective that the post-war West German Bundeswehr adopted a modified version, the MG-3, which remained in service for decades and remains in limited use today. The concept of Auftragstactic mission command, as it is now usually called, has been formally adopted as doctrine by the United States Army, the British Army, and most NATO members. It is, in a real sense, the most important German military legacy of the war, not a weapon, but a way of thinking. What those soldiers actually faced, the ones who threw themselves flat at the sound of the MG-42, who hugged walls in bombed-out cities while snipers waited above, who heard the rising scream of Nebelwerfer rockets and had nowhere to go, what they faced was not just hardware. It was the product of a military culture that had, through a combination of historical circumstance, systematic thought, and genuine brilliance, developed perhaps the most effective tactical land combat system of the industrial age. It was also a system built in service of one of the most destructive and criminal enterprises in human history. The Wehrmacht that executed Auftragstactic so brilliantly was the same institution that participated in, enabled, and in some cases enthusiastically carried out crimes on a scale that defies comprehension. The German soldier who used the MG-42 to defend a hilltop against American attackers was often the same kind of soldier who stood guard at a ghetto, or marched prisoners into a forest, or looked away while things were done that no decent person should have tolerated. History does not allow the separation of the tactical from the moral. The weapons were real, the skill was real, the terror they produced was real, and so was the cause in which they were deployed and what that cause demanded and what it produced. The men who faced those weapons and prevailed, the men who learned, adapted, absorbed punishment that should have been impossible to absorb, and kept advancing, those men deserve the final word. Not the weapons, not the doctrine, not the engineering ingenuity that produced them. The men who faced them and did not stop.